She is a CNRS research fellow in anthropology at the Laboratory of Ethnology and Comparative Sociology at the University of Paris, Montpellier. And her current research deals with the material and symbolic treatment of dead migrants at the southern borders of Europe. She also has many publications, and like I said, she contributed to the intervention special issue that someone mentioned earlier. So feel free to look those up. And today, Carolina and Florence are going. Do you want to say a little bit about your format, or we will? Okay, all right. So I won't say anything then. Go ahead. Where's yours?
So with Canada, we are trying kind of experience to bring our two fieldwork together. So basically, Korean force workers who died in Japan in the 20th century and African border crossers who died while trying to enter. Okay, excellent, thank you. So, Korean force workers who died in Japan in the 20th century and African border crossers who died while trying to enter Europe in the 21st century are here with us. In the gymnasium of the former Orokanai school in North Japan, two men holding each other by the shoulders sing a song about hope, surrounded by 100 of people of all ages, also expressing their emotion. One of the two men works at the Chosun School, a Korean school in Japan affiliated to the Chongyun Association, which is historically close to North Korea. The other is a South Korean historian working on the Japanese colonization. After joyfully celebrating the few days of the meeting held there, they have just been talking about the deteriorating relations between the two Koreas. How far away peace and reunification seem, one of them says. Just behind them, facing the participants, a table covered with white tablecloths serves as an altar. On it stand funeral urns covered with white damask fabric. They are surrounded by ancestral tablets bearing the names of colonial workers who died building the Shumari Dam between 1938 and 1943. As it is the case every year, the Korean-Japanese Association Stepping Stones for Peace organized its annual workshop in the north of the island of Hokkaido near the Shumari Dam. The workshop activities are divided between visits to important sites in the history of these forced workers, the dam, the tombs, and the site of the temple where the ancestral tablets were found, and moments of discussion and conviviality. In this gymnasium, friendly conversation and meals alternate with the testimonies of former witnesses to forced labor, of those of Koreans from Japan recounting their family's difficult history. Also, the aim of this gathering is to care for those who died during forced labor. These few days are above all about lively fraternal relation between Koreans, separated by division, and between Koreans and Japanese. Nevertheless, the dead are materially present and literally at the heart of the event. Their remains are placed on the altar at the beginning of the workshop and removed at the end. Together with the ancestral tablets, the central vector of the relationship with the dead in the context of East Asian ancestral rites. In the workshop day-to-day interactions, the dead, the victim of forced labor, are only mentioned occasionally. Their presence, past and present, does not usually give rise to spontaneous comments. Yet they are there directly, visibly, and tangibly in the form of ashes and ancestral tablets placed in the middle of the meeting room. They require special attention as they are brought in, carefully placed on the table and taken out. More indirectly, they are also present as the origin of the gathering, which began with exhumation projects, and as indirect adopted ancestors for Zainichi participants, that is, Koreans who arrived in Japan during the colonial era and their descendants. Their central place in the middle of the common room makes it clear that this gathering would not exist without these past lives.
In Catania, Sicily, every visit to the cemetery, accompanied by the team working on the database to gather information and try to identify the border crossers who have died in the Mediterranean Sea and whose nameless bodies are buried there, is always the same. We park the car while discussing appointments, music on the radio, or whatever comes into our minds. We then take a few steps to reach the migrant square, slightly sloping area containing 4 rows of 17 mounds, each marked by a black metal plaque planted in the ground. The plaques bear an alphanumeric code, dates, and the names of ships. Suddenly, everyone stops talking. Silence falls upon us. For a moment, Ricardo, Davide, Silvia seem to be rooted to the spot. The air feels heavier, the atmosphere oppressive. This does not last long. Soon words and movements resume. Davide removes the covers of his camera and begins to walk discreetly around the square to take some pictures. Pointing to a small print that someone has left next to a plaque, Silvia explains that every time she finds flowers, small objects, or images on these graves. Every time, even when we are in a hurry, when we need a copy of a document, we want to ask something to the director of the cemetery, there is always a moment when the air seems to change texture. I once asked Silvia, is it just me, or does something happen when we are at the cemetery? It's not just you, she replied. I feel it too. I think, she says, everyone does. Even though I've been there many times and I don't have a problem with it, I always feel something in front of those nameless places. Silvia was unable to put into words the feeling she has when she stands in the cemetery in front of the graves of men and women whom she did not know when they were alive, but to whom she's now very close. This something is perhaps a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, distress, and at least partly related to her rejection of the border regime and her commitment to welcoming migrants, both living and dead. But she may also be feeling the atmosphere of the place, that is, the affects that emerge and that are transmitted within the interaction between human beings and the material environment. In this presentation, we will explore a selection of accounts describing different ways of relating to the dead, collected in the course of our respective investigations on Korean forest workers who died in Japan in the 20th century, and on death on the European borders in the 21st century. This is the first time we are working together, and it's very experimental for us, inspired by the notion of resonance as developed by anthropologist Lisa Meseri. Instead of comparing our fieldworks, we have preferred to bring into resonance different narratives. As we understand it, resonance describes how we detect and amplify connections between distant objects and distant worlds. We have proceeded in our work, not necessarily in the presentation, we have proceeded by constantly going back and forth between our respective fieldwork, guided by this process by resonance in different ways of sensing the dead. For the purpose of the paper, we wish to leave aside today the differences between our case studies and consider, please, instead, for a moment at least, the different ways in which these two worlds are the same.
In the stories that follow, we shall see how active perception of the dead intensify a sense of connectedness and pave the way for a form of companionship with them. Feeling the weight, the density, or even the touch of the dead contributes to the emergence of affects. We will also examine how visual perception is altered by the relationship with the dead, whose own vision are embraced by the living. We are concerned more broadly with how particular modalities of perception of the dead shape our interlocutors' perception of the world around them. This is a transformative experience that exerts its influence beyond simply how the dead are perceived.
Sometimes the presence of the dead in the lives of the living intensifies and becomes more perceptible to the senses. He lives in my body. We are together. This is how Jacques Esso describes the place held in his life by the young Mustafa, whom he saw died beside him on the crossing to Europe. They were both among the 49 passengers in a small pirogue bound for Spain from Layun in the Western Sahara. None of them had life jackets, despite paying thousands of euros for their trip. The boat overloaded, capsized, and was lost at sea. Jacques remembers that they quickly ran out of water and food. It took them 5 days to be rescued. I saw that once, twice, so many times. There were 49 of us at the start, and only 43 arrived. And another brother died in hospital shortly after arriving in the Canaries, he recalled a few months later. Mustafa was the only one of the young men who died with whom Jacques had spent a little time before getting on the boat. He didn't know much about him, just that he came from a village near Bamako and that, like him, loved football. He remembers the impassionate discussion they had about the Lions and the Eagles. It took Jacques a long time to get back to sleep after the shipwreck. Both the nights and the days were difficult until one particular moment that he remembers vividly. One early morning at sunrise, I was lying in bed and I felt that Mustafa was there. He was by his side, and that made him feel better. He says, relieved. Jacques feels the weight of his friend upon his shoulder. It is not a heavy weight, he explains. Rather, it is the sensation of being touched gently, a form of warm, kinesthetic contact. He is at once carried and supported by this revenant as much as he in turn carries and supports him.
The impression of feeling the weight of the dead, of being able to be physically in touch with them, also appears in the material gathered on the Korean dead. The context of various repatriations of remains, generally in the form of ashes contained in urns, several participants expressed afterwards how by carrying an urn in their arms, they began to carry the person himself. The tactile contact with the urns, and even more its weight felt against their own bodies, induced a sense of physical and emotional contact with the dead. 2 children of about 11 years old who took part in the return of the remains with their school describe how they felt connected with the dead that they were carrying. The moment I held the urn with the remains to my chest, I could feel a person returning, full of the unfulfilled desire to return home. I hoped that the loneliness and resentment that this person had felt for a long time in another country would melt away with the relaxing energy of the hometown, and that he would be able to sleep peacefully, said one of the students. Another noted, I was exhausted because of the scorching heat, but I overcame it by thinking of these people, and that compared to the 70 years of waiting before repatriation, it was really nothing at all. When I received a body remains, their weight was transmitted like a weight in my heart. I committed myself with the wish that they could return to their homeland and rest peacefully. Isuo, a South Korean Union leader, recalled a similar experience, a similar encounter, while he was taking part in another repatriation project. This time, the person whose remains contained in a funeral urn I was clutching to my chest to bring back home was called Pak Mudok and was a forced laborer born in 1899. Although he was wrapped up in a white cloth hanging around my neck, he was becoming extremely heavy. Was it because of his resentful sadness at an unjust fate? And then, after having described the repatriation process, he added, the remains of Mr. Pak Mudok, a worker forcibly mobilized by Japanese colonization, which had been clutching to my chest until then, felt incredibly lighter than he was when we departed from Japan. Contact with the urn and the remains become contact with the dead persons themselves. This doesn't mean that the ashes becomes a person. Here, the dead cannot be reduced to the remains, especially since the people who take care of them know that ashes may have been partially mixed and that the remains they are carrying may not exactly come from the person whose name is written on the urn. What we want to emphasize here is that it's not the mere presence of the remains that induces this encounter. This life connection is above all driven by felt contact, by physical sensation, and the feeling of weight against one's own body.
Mrs. Giordano works in the death section of the Catania Registry Office. She's in her late 50s, and she has been there for a very long time. She deals with the files of those who have died at sea, those poor young people who died alone, as she says. Since the beginning of the project, to gather information about the bodies buried in the municipal cemetery, Mrs. Giordano has given up her time and energy to help the members of the Red Cross team to understand the administrative itinerary of the documents surrounding the bodies and to try to find clues that could reunite the bodies and their names and biographies. Every time we visited her at her office, she showed her compassion and esteem for these poor youngsters. She told us how these deaths were not like the others, and she knows a lot about death. She told us she kept them in her head and in her heart. Once she expressed what had changed for her since she started looking after the dead in the Mediterranean. She said, I will quote, "A lot has changed for me. I often think about these poor youngsters. Yes, for me, I don't see the sea the same way anymore. When I go to the beach at times, I don't feel well. It doesn't make me want to go swimming. I think of these shipwrecks of those poor young people." End of quote. When I pointed out that it was something very strong, she simply answered, "Yes, that's true. I don't see the sea the same way anymore," as if the color has changed. Mrs. Giordano does not know how her perception has been transformed, but she's sure that the sea, which is an important component in the landscape of her life ever since she was born, is now no longer the same. She cannot describe the new color she sees, but she is convinced that she views it differently. I'm not saying this just to say, I feel it, Carolina.
South Korean woman who is a member of an activist association in Jeju and who took part in a project exhuming Korean force workers in Okinawa, recalled in a written report how the past and the presence of the dead, both from forced labor and from the violence inflicted on the people of Okinawa, came to overlay the landscape before her eyes. I'm quoting, "I was heading to northern Okinawa by car. As I drove down the two-lane road that waved between sugarcane fields and barbed wire fences, the fields before my eyes gave me a strange feeling. It occurred to me that somewhere in Okinawa's sugarcane fields might lie the souls of the victim of forced labor in Okinawa. Across the sugarcane field, I could see a Japanese self-defense force base and a US military base. No matter how hard I tried to shake off the feeling, the image of Okinawans and their ancestors being robbed of their land just wouldn't go away." If we extend this question of landscape perception further, we can also note how emotions are expressed through the landscape. This is especially the case when the issue at stake is how to appease the dead, as appeasing the dead requires someone perceiving their feelings. It has also to do with sharing an emotionally powerful experience through literary or even poetic expression. I'm quoting, "As we landed at Kimpo Airport, the rain was falling. Was it the tear of these bitter ghosts? We had a brief welcoming ceremony at the airport and told them they were back home," writes one activist. Another describes, "When we left, the torrential rain that had poured down at the Korean stele stopped, and the sky cleared, as if it had always been this way. Perhaps the sky was mourning with us. Describing a problematic situation, she adds, I wonder how the dead victim of Joseon sees this reality. I got out the soju I had prepared and poured some alcohol as an offering. Took a moment to comfort the souls of the dead. I left with a heavy heart, hoping to have brought some comfort to the souls of the dead. South of Ito Bay, the clouds over the Pacific Ocean seemed to dissipate.
So just some words to finish. As a Buddhist monk, as we were among Buddhists yesterday, as a Buddhist monk emphasized during a campaign of repatriating Korean forced workers in 2015, it's difficult to relive the past, but it's possible to encounter it. The living with whom we are dealing with here put their bodies and sensory faculties at the service of the wandering dead. The perceptive apparatus of the living becomes a medium for making the dead present. But it's not just a question of the presence of the dead in the lives of the living. Our interlocutors establish a very intimate relationship with these dead people. There is a form of embodiment at play, of course, to different degrees. In this process of incorporation, if we may say, the boundaries between the materiality and the immateriality of the dead are blurred, to the extent that they might not even make sense. Through these new forms of being with the dead, of keeping them close and active, other narratives emerge of the contemporary border regime, of the Korean forced laborers who died in Japan, and these narratives counter the official discourses silencing the very existence of these dead people sometimes. The intimate experience of sensing the dead is also transformative. It shapes, we think, the relationship to the world in profoundly new ways.
Sorry about this.
Thanks, Fernanda. Our final speaker is Professor Judith Misrahi-Barak, who of course needs no introduction. She is the co-convener and co-I of Thanatic Ethics and general editor of the series Cocoa Pages that many of you know about, the latest